Hello. In the last couple of lectures, we are exploring various dimensions of change, organization and organization development, and today we will more focus on organizational theories. And in next couple of lectures, we will explore different aspects of understanding the given organization. In this lecture, I want you to see and understand what are this organizational theory, organizational life cycle. Then we will also look at the population ecology theory, institutional theory, open systems theory, organizational subsystems, and how organization and environmental interface can be understood. We will also look at the way the different stages of the organization can help us to increase overall organizational effectiveness. So the best way to start organizational theory discussion is that organizations go through a sequence of steps, stages which are predictable. So that means we try and see the growth and development from a point of view of the organizational life cycle. As we know, the life cycle has these stages of birth, growth, decline and death. So the four principal stages of the life cycle can also be applied to the organizational system. So that means we construct these words as organizational life cycle. So that means we are talking about organizational birth, organizational growth, organizational decline as well as organizational death. In other words, theories which helps us to see or help us to look at these life cycle becomes very important. So organizations are born, as we are seeing, individuals or entrepreneurs come together. So they recognize a business opportunity and to use their skills and to create value. And create value means they are able to bring a change in the marketplace through introduction of new products or services, and there are customers who pay money for such products and services, and that's what we are talking about is this creation of value. So the organizational birth is the most dangerous in terms of the life cycle stage because it is associated with the greatest chance of failure. So the several of the people are talking about that at the initial stage itself one need to be careful. So this population ecology theory talks about this birth as well as the next stages. The theory seeks to explain the rate at which the new organizations take birth and also the die in a population of organizations. So that means they are talking about which are those things very conducive for this birth of the organization, which are of those situations where it does not help the organizations to grow and contribute, and also contributes for the decline of the organization. So the population ecology theory, the rate of birth of new organizations in an environment, they talk about increases rapidly at first. So that means you will see there are mushrooming, but then it tapers off, and there are different reasons for explaining this, the shape of the curve over a period of time. So in some situations it is a very conducive kind of an environment, then it moves like a typically like an S curve. Then it reaches that kind of a plateau, but a lot of initial investments are made in terms of increasing the number of organizations, but some of them will grow, but many of them will decline. So the population ecologists have identified two sets of strategies that organizations can use to gain access to resources and increase their chances of survival. So that means an early entrant. So if you are the kind of what people talk about the first mover advantages. So that is, if you are the first, then you are likely that you will have a more survival, and also kind of a late entrant strategy where that you do have a set of experiences of the other people, and then you can see to that where you want to do that required piggybacking and things like that. So the kind of a thing is that very specialist strategy versus the generalist strategy in terms of establishing the organization, ensuring that the survival of the organization and over a period of time. Several books have come in terms of talking about the build to last, the things like that, where you are trying to see how do organizations survive and contribute over a period of time. So when you are talking about this, there is an institutional theory of growth. That means organizational growth is the life cycle stage in which organizations develop skills and competencies that allow them to acquire additional resources. So the institutional theory studies that how organization can grow and survive in a competition or in a competitive environment by satisfying the stakeholders. So the organizations all the time meets those stakeholder expectations, understands, and by doing this it draws that kind of a required energy to expand, grow and contribute. So institutional theory also argues that to increase the chances of survival, the organization adopt many of the rules and codes of conduct found in the institutional environment. So that means the institutional environment is defined as the set of values and norms in an environment that govern the behavior of organizations. So it is able to understand, it is able to relate to, and then by adopting this the rules and procedures, it survives. And then the institutional theory of growth have tried to explain this kind of a thing. Organizational isomorphism is conforming because the organizations are conforming to a common institutional environment. So the question is, the result is something referred to as organizational isomorphism. Organizational isomorphism, the term for the similarity among the organizations in a population. That means if you see the code of conduct, the recruitment rules, the various practices within, so all that gets controlled by the external environment, which also sends signals of what is correct and what is not correct. So institutional theory identifies three processes that explain why organizations become similar over time. It could be the coercive, or it is also called as mimetic, and also it is the kind of a normative. So coercive isomorphism is that the rules of the game, expectations are stated very clearly, and you are severely punished for not following. So we are seeing that some of the hotels and entertainment things are to be closed by this hour. So and the businesses to start around this hour. So these are like very clearly laid out by the society of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Similarly, the normative ones are the unwritten rules, but it is clarified through series of expectations. But the disadvantages, if you see that the very clearly, although isomorphism leads to a kind of a stability and a kind of a legitimacy, but it has many disadvantages. So in other words, organizations may learn ways to behave the way what people call it as they become outdated and may no longer they lead to the organizational effectiveness. That means they may not be creating a kind of a value. So they exist but not perceived as anywhere or any closer to the requirements of the customer, and that is where it fails as a system of delivery. So, the institutional theory, the ecological aspects and the earlier ones, it always talks about what triggers the organizational birth, the organizational growth and also the organizational decline. But the Greiner went little further in using the word life cycle model of growth. The Greiner through life cycle model of growth proposed that organizations pass through the 5 stages, and then each stage ends in a kind of a crisis, and organizations respond to overcome this crisis through reorganization. So, to advance from one stage to the other, the organization must successfully manage and survive, solve the problems associated with each of such crisis situations. I tried to explain this model quickly in the previous lectures, but this one would clearly show what Greiner meant in terms of the life cycle model of growth. As you will see in this, in the x-axis, there is this age of the organization, and the age of the organization has been described as the young as well as the mature. And similarly, we will see that the stages or the what we are talking about, the size of the organization. So, the age and size, when you see, we will start from that the small to a large organization, and at the beginning it is the small and the young organization. The small and the young organization means that it is basically we are talking about growth through creativity. So, that means a set of an entrepreneur with set of people, they work hard, they try and meet the customer understanding. They may not have the technology with them, they may not have the resources with them, they may not have the competencies with them. So, they work hard, acquire the competencies, acquire the rules of the game, acquire the resources, understand the customer, and try and do all the things whatever required to meet those customers' things. So, the growth through creativity, it is always on the flux, always it is creating new value propositions and moving rapidly and brings that kind of a high energy. Now, let us see that if any of these things are not happening, then the organization may gets into the kind of a decline mode at that stage itself. But then there becomes a crisis of leadership. The crisis of leadership is, so yes, they have all done, but now tell me what is in it for me. So, people start thinking end of the 3, 4, 5 years, 2 years could be in some situations. So, then tell me I worked hard, now what is my role, what is my designation, what is this to be, who will do what, the kind of things. So, that means you have to create an organization. So, it has to have a kind of a purpose, it has to have a kind of a long term goal, it has to have the kind of a structure which provides or meets the career and career aspirations. I think that is where you move through the second step or the second stage of growth called the growth through the direction. And growth through the direction where the individuals define the kind of a structure, the individuals define the kind of the future, so they start moving around that. But then since all of it is a kind of a thing, control thing, there is a crisis of autonomy. In a crisis of autonomy, people would like to see now why, because now it has become large, it has now people know the rules of the game, so they are prepared to take the responsibilities. So, they want much more guidance than dictating everything step by step. So, people are used to this set of tasks, and set of things have gone into in terms of the standardization. And that is where you see the crisis of autonomy should be referred to through the crisis of delegation, but then crisis of delegation would make much more divisions, much more empowered groups, things like that. Then you move through one more, that is, as these people are called so and so, as the functional heads or the business group heads, things like that, then there will be a crisis of control. The crisis of control, duplication of resources, people are not accountable to each other, interdependencies are not well managed as it used to happen in the first stage. Then it runs through an aspect of coordination. People don't know what is happening in other divisions or in other groups. So they run into the issues of the crisis and the crisis of this control, and that has to be taken care of through the coordination. So that means newer coordination mechanisms are required, and then so integration, so production, whatever call it as the coordination groups or the newer integrator or some few general managers positions are created. So growth comes through this kind of a coordinated activity. But as you put this coordination, suddenly you will see there is a corporate and then there are units. Different manufacturing units are controlled by the corporate office, but the corporate office defines the broad rules of the game, but the specifics are adopted by each of the divisions, each of the units. Lot of correspondence, lot of movement of papers, and then the code of conduct and rules of the game and things like that. It makes it much more kind of a red tapeism, or what people call it. It slows down, and substantial time is spent in meetings and things like that. So that's the time where you feel that paper has to be replaced and through some other mechanisms. Then one can think in terms of the growth through this kind of a collaboration. So that means you bring in more team spirit and they work on various processes within the organization. So the Greiner model interestingly brings these two combination of things, the age and the size of the organization. And each time whatever we do, it leads to another stage of crisis, another stage of another level of functioning, and that leads to another crisis, and they are talking about continuously how to manage these things. So Greiner's life cycle model of growth has been a very, very interesting model to understand, and the crisis can lead to the decline of the organization, also leading to the death of the organization. But successful things always can lead to a better performance. So organizational decline is the life cycle stage that enters when it fails to anticipate, recognize, avoid, neutralize or adapt to the external or internal pressures that threaten its long-term survival. As we have seen in the context of managing changes in the organization, there are issues where people don't understand the drivers of the external change, or not able to meet with the aspirations of the internal people, and that's where the organization experiences this. So an organization may not easily adapt to meet these changes in the environment. Suddenly when price or technology becomes irrelevant, so the competition becomes so intense, and that's the time where the organizational inertia results from the forces inside an organization, maybe in the aging of the workforce, where people are not prepared to move or change into new technologies, or able to work with that required speed, so or they don't want to without a price. We have seen happening in the textile mills. So many of the textile mills closed down because they were not able to move to the newer technologies, or able to improve their productivity and productivity standards, and the markets, when it got opened up, so there was a demand for a higher quality of output, and also at the lesser price, and many other countries were able to supply the same things. So the new technologies had to be deployed, and unless those things were deployed which involved less manpower. So organizations which had more manpower and not able to reduce that kind of a manpower or increase that kind of a productivity and were not able to manage the required changes in the technology and the people dimensions had to close down. So we talk about the sickness in the organization or sickness of the industry. This sickness is a kind of a pre-stage of the decline and the death. So organizations become sick in order to where they are not in a position to manage changes internally to meet those external realities and external situations. So the organizational decline occurs by degrees according to what we are seeing is Wetzel and Johnson. So they have identified 5 stages of decline, and management action can reverse the decline at each stage, and probably they accept the last stage is of the dissolution. So each of these stages need to be understood. So the stage 1, they call it as a kind of a blinded. Organizations are unable to recognize the internal or external problems that threaten their long-term survival. So it could be the changes in the technology or demands of the customers for newer product and newer processes, and that's when the competitors are introducing new products and services. So if you are blinded about those things because you have a committed customers and committed people for a long period of time, the organization takes it for granted. Then the stage 2 is a kind of inaction despite very clear signals of suddenly you see that your market share is decreasing and not able to see, it happened for many companies in the television markets. When the foreign competition was increasing, they thought yes, they will be able to continue because they had the market leadership, they thought they could survive. It has happened in the consumer markets, in particular television, the fridge. So when Samsung and LG entered, many of the well established companies, they thought they have the leadership in the marketplace, but then they could not go in an offensive mode, but certainly it affected their long term health. So despite clear signs of declining of performances, the top management takes little attention or little action or sometimes no action. So they are blinded and there is an inaction, and then stage 3 could be the faulty action. So that means you suddenly go in a full hog about the advertisements, which may not bring the kind of required results, but you have spent a lot of time and a lot of money, but with too little kind of a thing, because you have not introduced new technology or new products, but trying to create an impact in the marketplace through only advertisements. So the managers may have made the wrong decisions or they change too little things, so the problems of this nature. And then the stage 4 very clearly can be seen as a kind of a crisis. By the time this stage has arrived, only some radical changes in strategy and structure can stop the decline. So that means substantially you have to do a kind of a backward integration, or you have to buy some new technologies because there is no time for development, or you have to recruit in a massive way to do some new things in the marketplace. So that means definitely a crisis has set in, actions have little chances of success, and organizations are not too sure what if done will result in what kind of performance, and that's the time where you can also see it reaches a level of stage 5, a dissolution. So a kind of a decline is irreversible and which the organization cannot recover. So we have seen, as I said, mentioned, these textiles. Many of the textile mills resulted in this. So the old machineries, the aging workforce, and attitudes are very strong. no money to give incentives, and unless you give incentives, no activities, and by the time whatever the things you put together, you produce the quality which is where you cannot market, and also you are not in a position to invest in raw material which is of high quality, because you have no capacity to process such fine and costly raw material. So, that's the stage where that you are not in a position to focus on your suppliers, not on your processes, not on your people, and the structure is ineffective, and together results in that kind of a sickness, which can, what people talk about is that turnover chances are very, very low. So, that means you are not able to turn around the organization towards any better performance. I think the important step we do to see the organization as open systems. I think that is where open systems theory of organization becomes much more useful, and understanding of this will help people to redesign and refocus. Open systems theory defines an organization as best could be as a kind of an open social system. What are we talking? It consists of the patterned activities of a group of people that tends to be goal directed, and this definition contains the three key elements: an open social system, and a kind of a patterned activities, and it is always a goal directed behavior. So, all the three could be elaborated, and they see that the system means a set of interrelated, interdependent and interacting elements that acquire inputs from the environment, transforms them into some form of useful output, and discharges them to an external environment. So, that means there is a resource interdependence, then the interrelating various elements within the organization to convert these inputs, and the transformation, and then contributing to the output which is back to the. So, that is where we are talking about open systems theory as in terms of the social system. The social system exists within a changing social environment that requires them to adapt to the newer demands. So, that means according to this theory, that organizations are part of the changing context of the business. Economic, social, technological changes within the society demands or drives the changes within the organizational system. So, in other words, all social systems are open systems. So, no organization can say that they do not depend on the external things, or they can think that they can survive and deliver the services without understanding the changes which is coming in the societal systems. So, an open system must interact with the environment to survive. So, that means it must obtain resources from the environment, and it must export products and services back to the environment. So, whatever happens in the organization, it is a simple function of the kind of changes, the kind of things happening at the larger system or the societal system. So, when we are talking about the pattern activities, we can talk about what are the stable and predictable events. I think that continue to occur with regularity. So, even though we talk about organizational system as open systems, but they are not so chaotic. That means still they have some boundaries. So, that means the activities are complementary and interdependent with respect to a common goal. So, that means every organization does set of activities which which meets the societal system requirements. And also the pattern activities means that they can only be viewed maybe as a kind of one at a time as they occur. And then for example, the pattern activities in a hospital include such activities as admitting patients, conducting diagnostic tests, performing operations, providing health care. So that means you can see any organization does several of these things. Several of these things which can be put in a kind of a sequence and an interdependent fashion, but one feeds to the other. And the third view is that there is a common goal. So when we are talking about the systems, then what are we talking? The Katz-Kahn defined the 10 common characteristics of open systems. That helps us to understand the concept of an organization. So let's go through these 10 characteristics to see how it is important to maintain all of these things. First is the importance of energy. So all open systems that import some form of energy from the external environment. So that means the time whatever the organization gets created, so it is important that in many forms it will come. That means the human resources in terms of the raw material, in terms of the financial resources, the status, the recognition, satisfaction or future expectation, all of these things are defined externally. And then the next step is there is a throughput. So that is means the organization takes this energy and then gets into that kind of a transformation process or the throughput process. So the open system transforms the energy into a product or into a service. So universities conduct classes and seminars and then educate students, and the educated students are seen as a kind of an output. So irrespective of whether it is a correctional system or it is educational system or a hospital system, so every organization can be viewed as an open system. So it depends upon the energy and the resources to the outside elements. And then the second one, as an open systems theory, is that they focus on this transformation which meets some of the requirements of the society. So that means there is also an output. So that means they produce an end product and a service and export it back to the environment. So there is an input and there is a throughput and the output. And similarly, the systems as a kind of a cycle of events. So the product produced by an open system is, again, it could be recycled within the environment and transformed into more raw materials. So that means it is not that one time affair, it can come back to the system and then you get either re-educated or you work on the same raw material to do different things. And the another concept is a kind of a negative entropy. So the open system always means there should be possibility of more energy coming to the organization, more resources coming to the organization from its environment to the organization, which expands in terms of producing its products, can store energy, and it can also get into that achieve negative entropy, where it feels sometimes that it can live, it can survive without depending on the external changes or external environment. And similarly, when we are talking about the open system thing, the information input, the feedback, understanding and the coding processes all become very relevant. So this information is necessary to help the organization to adapt for changing environment. So that means the sensing mechanisms, the clear perceptions of what is happening, and the use of that external information to bring about internal changes are a part of this open systems view of the organization. And similarly, we are talking about the steady state and the dynamic homeostasis. So that means the organization and its subsystems and substates must be able to maintain a kind of a state of balance. And in the balancing act, that means it is giving little more value to the external environment, and otherwise it gets pressured in terms of less resources, or it may not get that kind of a required status and support from the external environment. So in other words, it's a kind of a dynamic balancing act in terms of what it uses and what it gives back to the other systems. Another characteristics of this open system is the differentiation. It refers to the development of a specialized function or a division of labor. So the organization tries to, as it takes more resources, probably whenever if they are not so environmental friendly, so then they create a new group of people who will work on these new technologies, or they may do something which, for example, when they cut the trees, so they may say a kind of a function which does that more and more of planting trees and forestation. So the question is that it gets into that kind of a specialized and focused activities, and it does these things to meet the kind of pressures what it gets from this environment. And the ninth characteristic is about this integration and coordination. As organizations grow, they become more differentiated. The more differentiation is required to meet the external resource acquisition and the kind of throughput activities and also the products and services it provides back to the open system. So then this differentiation requires some sort of coordination. So process to integrate the various activities and making sure that there is no wastage of resources, wastage of activities, and bringing all these subsystems together. And the other word is used is equifinality. So the concept of equifinality refers to the idea that an organization can reach the same final state from a variety of parts. So that means there are different methods to achieve. So organization has always the goal centric, but also can adopt different methodologies to identify or they get into that end results. So a specific size by following variety of different paths, sometimes it can increase the capacity of the people, sometimes more people can do, or it can do less people with more technology and things like that. And that is where the relationship between organizations as a whole and organization subsystems becomes very necessary. So an organization is composed of several subsystems, and so five subsystems that are necessary for any organization to survive and grow are very, very relevant, and we can focus on those subsystems. One of the key subsystems is this production subsystem. The production subsystem produces the products and services of the organization and represents all the primary transformation activities. So whenever we see production subsystem, it is focusing on the speed, it is focusing on the efficiency, it is focusing on the using of the less material but giving more value. And the other one is the maintenance subsystem. They are primarily concerned with maintaining it could be the social involvement of the employees, making sure that the machineries are kept up to date, the older machineries are replaced, or the compensating employees in a fair manner. So providing attractive benefits, making sure the tasks are not seen as monotonous, so creating favorable working conditions and rewarding outstanding performance to create motivation so that the activities are performed at the expected levels. So the maintenance subsystems is equally important compared to that what we are talking about the production subsystems. Then you also require the adaptive subsystems. The adaptive subsystems activities include clearly the gathering information about the problems and opportunities in the environment. Today we are using this adaptive subsystem to the next level called the BI, business intelligence. You understand the kind of customers, you understand the suppliers, you understand the kind of a governing rules and mechanisms in the society. So, continuously adaptive systems gather the data and analyze this data for the organization, and so developing creative innovation to help the organization to adapt and change. So, depending on what are the newer rules of the game. So, the adaptive subsystems also it helps the organization to be looking for newer opportunities, growth opportunities, and also creating a new value to the stakeholders, customers, the suppliers, and things like that. Then one should also talk about the supportive subsystems. So, the supportive subsystem includes two major functions, both in terms of the procurement as well as disposal. When we are talking about today the supply chain management, we are really talking about the procurement systems. In fact, today the arguments in the business situation is that everybody can have a locational advantages. Everyone will also have a technology advantages. So, what really matters is that the way efficiently they are able to gather the raw materials and with the speed with which they can supply and do that required servicing. So, the supportive subsystems essentially perform these roles of the procurement and also the disposal. And what we are talking about is the procurement activities involve securing resources and energy from the environment, and the disposal includes marketing and sales efforts to dispose of the products, not in a negative term, but in terms of reaching out to the customer into the environment. So, the procurement and the disposal subsystems are so critical today because the throughput technology, all these are getting standardized, and so the margins, the performance things comes around these two subsystems. And finally, one also talks about the managerial subsystems. The managerial subsystems has the responsibility of the directing the other systems of the organization, what we talked about, the throughput, the acquiring of the resources, how these resources should be reaching different groups in the environment in terms of the disposal. So, the managerial subsystem is also responsible for developing the organizational structure and directing the task within each of the subsystems. So, together all the 5 systems help the organization to perform at different stages of its growth and the sustenance of this growth. So, the next important thing one we need to see is that all organizations are required to interact with the environment. I think that is what is the concept of the open systems. So, the interface between the organization and its environment has great influence on the survival and effectiveness of the organization. So, how does this organization can relate to or can understand? So, when we see the environment, the organization environment is one can see as infinite. However, it is to focus on specific aspects of the environment, what people call it as where we have the organizational sectors. So, the 8 of the most important organizational sectors are very relevant, and we can discuss on those things. So, people talk about this as the relevant environment or the specific environment, or where the organization dependencies on the environmental elements are very high, or also it gets influenced by these elements for its survival and for its growth. What are those 8 elements? The human resource sector is one of the key things, what people also call it as the labor markets. So, the human resource sector includes the labor market and the dimensions of labor market. In terms of it includes the sources from which the people will come to the organization or the potential employees. So, how you can get them. It also talks about the various employment agencies. It talks about the educational system in general, the universities, many of these things. So that means the organizational critically depends on its kind of a quality and the capacities and the competencies of its manpower. So when sufficient supply is not there, the organization gets affected, where you may not get the kind of a right people for the right job. So then organization invests in educational institutions, and then possibly it contributes for restructuring of the syllabuses, restructuring of the training process itself. If these things cannot be done, then organization has to spend much more time and resources within the organization to transform this human resource. So this is one of the key dependence. And the second part is the kind of raw material. So the raw material sector means, we are talking about in a university system, it could be the paper, it could be the pencils, it could be the technologies. It could be in terms of when people talk about the hospital, so it is the patients. It is a very wrong thing to talk about patients as the raw material, but what is important is that from the students is a kind of a raw material for the educational institutions to a patients in an hospital system. It is purely the different kinds of materials in a manufacturing sector. So the supply of this raw material, the consistency and the quality of the raw material influences the overall performance of the organization, both its throughput activities as well as the kind of output it talks about in satisfying the environmental elements. Apart from human resource and then the raw materials, the third one is the financial resources. So the financial resources includes definitely the way they can require money can be obtained. It could be the banks, it could be the loans, it could be the kind of savings of different people, it could be the donations, it could be the grants, it could be the kind of the financial resources which organization has to get from its environmental elements. So the human resource, the raw materials, the financial resources, and the next one could be in terms of the consumers and the markets. The outputs produced by the organization, you are talking about the consumers, it should be consumed by the customers and who purchases, who pay for the goods and services of the organization. So some are highly driven by the consumer markets and consumer preferences. For example, the fashion items, the highly depends upon the kind of the market fluctuations and the market changes. And similarly, the fast moving consumer durables called the FMCGs also depends substantially on the consumer preferences. It can change, and as it changes, that it has to provide some newer things. So the consumer and consumer preferences and the markets is another aspect which organizations bother and respond to. The next one is the technology sector. It includes the kind of developments happening within the particular technology domain. We are seeing the kind of cell phones. So as you are seeing, the new technologies are integrated into the cell phones. So what kind of work is going on within that, if you see technologies, it could be happening in the lab level, the scientific research centers, or it could be at the universities, or it could be the kind of R&D efforts within the organization or with the similar organization. So the technology provides another what people are talking about, a kind of a competitive edge. The next important thing is the industry sector. So when we are using this word industry, it refers to the other organizations in the same type of business. It could be the machine tool and machine building, or it could be in the textiles, or it could be in the automotive, or it could be in the agribusiness. So what you are trying to see is that what are the other organizations doing. So in the similar industry, if the lot of other people are coming into that similar industry, then you are seeing a kind of a very competitive kind of a situation. If you are the only one, then you are in a kind of a very monopolistic kind of a situation. So the industry sector, here we are trying to see how many people, how many organizations, how many entities are doing the similar kind of activities, and how many of them are in direct competition with you, providing extremely similar services and very close to the kind of operation what the organization is doing. And the next one is the economic sector. The success and effectiveness of any organization are influenced by the health of the overall economy. In other words, the success depends upon the overall employment availability. So if the more growth in the employment sector means there is more economic activity, the more economic activity means more money supply, things like that. So for example, for a machine building company, that the success of that depends upon the automotive companies. So if more automotive people are buying automobiles, then the success for that particular organization. So more automotive buying means then there must be more money supply. So that means more employment must be there. So the more employment demands that in influence in the housing and similar things. The question is that each of the sector in the economy feeds to the other. So a booming economy is one kind of a situation, or an economy with recessionary kind of a tendencies where money supply is less, people are not in a position to buy. So consumers are very careful, they are hoarding and holding on to the kind of wealth whatever they have, and then you see there is not much of an economic activity, and people use this word like the word stagnation or recession. These things do influence the performance of the organization. And the other important thing is the government sector. So this sector includes the federal, the state as well as the local laws which influences the regulatory aspects. It could be the allocation of the land, or it could be the shift hours, or it could be the employment of certain categories of people. So many of these things do influence, and what people also use is word government as well as the political system. And the political action and committees we are seeing suddenly brings pressures on the organization, and it may create an opportunity or it may seriously inhibit the opportunities before the organization. So the government sector, when the government, we are talking about the policies and practices not only of the local governance but at the state, as we have seen in terms of the language, in terms of the employment of the local persons, or the federal laws about the taxation or about the kind of exchange rates and things like that, which can economic as well as government factors can affect the performance of the organization. So in this kind of a thing, what is important is the boundary spanning roles. The activities that occur in buffering departments are often referred to as these boundary spanning roles. So basically to scan the environment and interpret the details of the environment to the organization. So to gather and process the information about the changes what is happening in the environment, and then to represent the organization by providing proper information and the details to the others. So this is where the two important activities of the boundary spanning. And to deal with the environmental uncertainty that managers don't have sufficient information most of the time, so they have to take very clear decisions to make the organization effective. So that is where there is kind of a risk, and one needs to talk about the risk and uncertainties, and organizations have to take actions to make this more effective, and it is sometimes very difficult to compute the cost of these things. So that is where the extent to which the whole external environment is simple or complex, and whether the events are stable or unstable. So dynamic, static, or simple or complex defines how organization can respond to. So the complexity refers to the number of external elements that are relevant to the organization. A simple environment where the organization interacts with only a very small number of external elements. But in a complex thing, it is dealing with several stakeholders which may influence the performance of the organization. So complex environment must interact with a large number of diverse external elements, and then it always tries to have that kind of a stability. So the external stability refers whether the elements of the environment are dynamic and constantly changing, or whether they are stable. Stable means that rate of change is low. We will expand on these things further, but essentially what we have covered in this session is we have talked about organizational theory, particularly the open systems theory, organizational subsystems, and how organization environmental interface gets defined. And in the next session we will continue our discussion on how to reduce these uncertainties, and how organizational theory helps in terms of increasing organizational effectiveness, and how organizations can achieve its goals and various types of goals, and the different approaches to measure this organizational effectiveness, from resource acquisition, transformation, output, recycling, consistency, and also we will talk about organizational climate and organizational culture. And the organizational theory helps us to get this overall picture or the functioning of the organization in its different forms.